Good morning, Calvert County 7th grade students and teachers, science teachers. This is Mr. Horton from CHESPAX, and we're going to do a virtual CHESPAX trip, try to take you through all the steps that would happen on a regular field trip and get you guys to help us with some of the data collection that needs to happen for our SAV monitoring project. So to start off, our big question for the day is we're looking at how does SAV interact with other living things in the ecosystem. So in other words, what is the effect of SAV on things like fish and waterfowl and so on? And then the flip side of that is how does the ecosystem itself impact the SAV? If we start doing things to the environment or things happen in a natural way to the environment, what does that impact on the SAV population? So one of the things that we've been doing, and we've been monitoring SAV for over 25 years now. That's 25 years of 7th grade generated data, and we've seen these SAVs go up and down in population. Just a few years ago, actually about 8 years ago, we saw one of the biggest declines in SAV. And what we were finding is what our students were finding on our trips, what scientists were finding throughout the entire bay was that the SAV was declining dramatically. And probably several factors involved there. We're not going to read the entire article right here, but if I can draw your attention to this bottom paragraph, you'll notice we've highlighted a few key words. Tropical Storm Lee. We had a couple of major storms that hit our area in 2011. That had a big impact on the SAV, along with things like sediment, dirt washing in from the land, getting into the water, and the big thing is that it's impacting the water clarity. I'm going to highlight that. Water clarity is the key. Without sunlight, without clean, clear water, these SAVs are just not going to survive very well. So I mentioned Tropical Storm Lee. Actually, that year we had two major storms. We had Hurricane Irene on your left. You can see the dates. Notice the dates here, August 27th, and then about 10 or 11 days later, we had Hurricane Irene hit our area. And for those who are familiar with the Upper Marlboro area, this is part of the Patuxent River, a branch of the Patuxent River, literally flowing through the streets of Upper Marlboro. So why does the storm have such an impact on SAV? You can probably think of some ideas, but big ones, of course, are going to be the water clarity is going to be ruined. We talked about that earlier. A lot of sediment gets brought in with these storms, and that can be a factor. But the physical force of those storms, if you notice in the background here, these trees laying down on the side of the road, you can imagine if that storm is powerful enough to rip out a tree and throw it up onto the street, what is it going to do to those little SAVs trying to grow in the water? You're going to see a lot of physical damage to our SAV growth. Now that sounds pretty bleak, but we know that the SAVs will come back. And this is just from a couple of years ago. We're noticing that SAV coming back to places in Solomon's Island where it hadn't grown in 40 or 50 years. In a generation, we haven't seen SAV growth, and we're starting to see it come back in some of these areas, like down in Solomon's. So some good. And it wasn't just happening in Solomon's, but you notice here we've got a 21% increase overall in the Chesapeake Bay's SAV growth. That was for the 2015 season. So we went from one of the lowest levels to some of the highest levels in just a few short years. So we can't give up hope on these ecosystems. They will return. And a term we use, one of the words that we use here a lot is resilience. We know these grasses can be resilient to changes in the ecosystem. They will return if given some time. We won't spend a lot of time on this graph, but one of the things that we know for sure is that the amount of rainfall is a driving factor in the growth of the SAV. And the little the dotted line that you can see in this image here, kind of follow that. The dotted line is sort of the average stream flow, or the average amount of rain that goes into our little streams, into the creeks, into the rivers, and ultimately the Chesapeake Bay. And then that solid dark line is the monthly average for 2015. And you notice almost every single month of the year, with a couple of exceptions, were below average. So that's one of the things that we can look at, whether an SAV growth are definitely linked. And a key term, and we're going to measure this during the trip, water clarity or turbidity is a factor. So obviously SAV needing sunlight, we want to see things kind of at this end of the spectrum, the lower levels of turbidity and not a high level. Tremendous amount of rain, the water can actually look like that on occasion, almost like a glass of chocolate milk. It's just that much sediment in the water. And scientists can even see this from space. They can use satellite technology to look at that water clarity or turbidity. And on the left image here, we're looking for the dark blues. That's going to indicate clean, clear water. And you can see the average. There's some blue there, but not a whole lot when you compare it to 2015, where there was a tremendous amount of that blue that you can see there. So blue indicates clean water. Clean water usually translates to lots and lots of SAV growth. So here's an image of the creek, and we'll also share a video giving you an idea of what we can see in the creek and what it looks like from a ground level. But we start out right. We typically start our classes in the little trailer right over here. We begin our day down at this fishing pier, which you can see here. And then we travel up the Patuxent, and then we make that turn right there into the creek. So the creek, you can kind of follow here this little ribbon of green that goes through marshes and some wooded areas, and that's where our 25+ year survey has taken place over these. Now we're interested in how much SAV growth there is, and those articles that we saw indicated that alone, just how much SAV there was. But one of the things that we also know is that the types of SAV rather will change. So when we began this program back in the early 1990s, the species that dominated our ecosystem was the one you see in the image right here. And this is called wild celery. And wild celery, a very important plant. It's a native species. It's a plant that originally from here in southern Maryland, and is now all but gone from our creek. We haven't seen wild celery in our creek probably in a good 5 or 6 years, if not longer than that. So it's been replaced by a non-native species known as hydrilla. And you can see just the way that hydrilla grows. I mean, look how it's just blanketed that creek. Those students that you can see in the image there probably can't paddle their canoe through that dense stand of hydrilla. So hydrilla gets so thick that it essentially blocks the light for any other SAVs that are trying to grow. And again, hydrilla, a non-native invasive species. So a couple of years ago, we brought some students from Calvert High School out with some drones to try to get an aerial image of the creek. And you can see from above now this is almost that exact location you just saw the students with the SAV that they could barely paddle through. This is all that's left. So something actually killed off the hydrilla in that area. We don't know what, but that aerial view sometimes gives you a nice picture of what's going on with the SAVs. Another shot. Notice though the SAV does often, when it does grow, often will hug the edges of the creek. And you may be able to guess why that would be so. Probably has something to do with water depth. SAV grows better in shallower water because of the sunlight that it can get. Now, I mentioned earlier the sediment being a problem for the SAV. Another issue is algae growth. And here's another one of our drone images. Shows that algae real well. That kind of green, overall greenish color, and then some deeper greens right in here behind that canoe. So algae growth and sediment are the two biggest threats to our SAV here in the creek. So some of the ways that we measure those environmental conditions, we use a tool called a fluorometer right over here. And the fluorometer, we'll talk more about that in the video we're going to show you, but the fluorometer tells us essentially how much algae growth we're seeing. Water temperature, the young lady here is measuring water temp with a digital thermometer. Temperature can also be one of those sort of physical factors that affects the growth of SAV. as does the salinity. Salinity can be a measure that we'll take, and that will show you how that works a little bit later on. But the big one, the one that really drives SAV growth, is water clarity. So these students here are looking down through a tube. Some of you 7th graders who are on our 5th grade field trip may have used this tool, but you can see these students here are looking at water clarity through that transparency tube. And we can compare, year to year, season to season. The graph right here is that real bad year that we had, the year that the SAV had died out in the creek. And you can just see a year later, think about that term resilience. Look at that, the water is much clearer. Basically what the scientists tell us, if we can see about 100 centimeters, that's sort of the benchmark. You can see it on this tube right here. That's what we consider our optimal range. And if you go back to the 2012 data, we barely topped 40 centimeters on that whole entire year. And the following year, we hit it several times. We even exceeded it twice. You can see here and here. And even when we didn't hit 100, we had lots of days in the 80s and the 90s and so on. But something to think about, we had a couple of days, even in that really good year, we were down well below 20 centimeters on a couple of our surveys. And you may have a good guess as to why that would be so. Probably storms. We may have had a big storm on a Thursday night. We canoed Friday morning, and we saw an increase in the amount of sediment that was in the water. When we go on these trips, we look at the water conditions, we look at the SAV, but we're always interested in the wildlife as well. So things like bald eagles and ospreys, cormorants, red-bellied turtles. I think we have a little video clip of a red-bellied turtle out there for you to check out. So lots of animals make their home in these creeks, and we like to make the connection. We hope we make the connection with you about how the conditions of the SAV affect things like reptiles, turtles and snakes, birds, mammals, and so forth. A couple of years ago, we had a visit right outside the CHESPAX office by a river otter. So even things like otters can be seen in our creek. All kinds of animals will live in and around these SAV beds. One of the things that we also do is we look for the fish species. We know things like otters and water snakes and so on feed largely on the small fish. So we do a fish survey, a seine. We haul that in, haul in the net, and we catch everything from baby rockfish, blue crab, lots of blue crab in some years, and we know things like anchovies, some of the smaller fish, actually provide that important food source for some of the other animals. Grass shrimp too, very important source of food for little rockfish. And then rarities, things that we rarely see, might be something like a pipefish, a northern pipefish, which lives in and around the SAV beds, almost looks like a piece of SAV as it hides from its predators and from its prey. So kind of getting back to our big ideas for the day, we look at what is that role of SAV? How does it provide resources for other living things in the bay? What are those cause and effect relationships out there? Things that might affect the growth of the SAV. This can help us, see what's going on in our ecosystem. What are some of the patterns? We're going to be collecting data over this season. What are the patterns that we can pull out of that data? And then, the big question really is, how do these environmental conditions, how does the water clarity, the temperature, the salinity affect the growth of the SAV? Again, that brings us back to our original question, how does SAV interact with the other living things? How does a river otter depend upon SAV for its growth? And then again, how are those environmental conditions affecting the growth of the SAV? We'll keep you posted on what's happening in the end of this season and hopefully give you a window into what's going on in our creek.